Okay, I guess we can get going. Well, I have to say I've been in Estonia now for a couple months, and I was a bit worried that there was a little bit of war fatigue or complacency, but the fact that we have to get all these extra chairs, I think, is an encouraging sign for me anyway, and potentially my Ukrainian colleagues in the audience. So I understand that nobody here is, here to hear me talk. I'm just here to introduce things, but so I'll try to keep it short. My name is Aaron James Wendland. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London. And apart from doing nerdy academic philosophy, working on people like Heidegger and Wittgenstein and Levinas, I've spent the better part of the past 5-7 years kind of covering current affairs for the New York Times, the New Statesman, the Toronto Star, a few other international publications. So I kind of dabble in academic philosophy, but also do a bit of sort of media work, or what I call public philosophy. And I'll explain a little later in my introductory remarks what public philosophy is. And I guess crucially, I am the editor of this special issue of Studia Philosophica Estonica on the Russia-Ukraine war. And it's a bit unusual for a philosophy journal to cover current affairs like Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it's also unusual for a philosophy journal to be dedicated to reaching a broader audience than the philosophy community. It's not often that a philosophy journal tries to reach out beyond. Part of my job in these introductory remarks is to explain why a philosophy journal is covering current affairs and what public philosophy is all about, what we're trying to do with this particular special issue of public philosophy. And I suppose maybe I'll also just say a little bit about the general sort of aims and maybe the best way to explain why we're doing this special issue of public philosophy is to kind of explain the backstory. So the Ukrainians have, of course, been fighting Russians since 2014. But the backstory for this special issue starts on February 24th, 2022. I was in Toronto at the time. I was a senior research fellow at Massey College in the University of Toronto. And I'm sure, like everybody in this room, I was sort of glued to my phone and my computer watching this column roll down from Belarus towards Kiev. And I was horrified by this. And I'm sure everybody in this room was horrified by this too. But what may have been different for you and me is that Canada is 6, 7, 8, 9,000 miles away from Kyiv. And Canadians are, just in some sense removed from what's happening in Europe. And it's also true that a lot of Canadians they've come to Canada because they fled places like Estonia in the 1940s, or they left Syria in 2015. So they are almost triggered by terrible global events, and they've come to Canada to get away from that. And what I found was that there was a bit of, I don't know if complacency is the right word, but life just went on as normal in Toronto. And that made me feel very uncomfortable, because it seemed like people didn't appreciate that the biggest event of the 21st century so far was happening, right? A major nuclear power was invading its neighbor with 120,000 troops, and people in Toronto are going out to the bar, and it just seemed wrong to me, right? And so a few months later, based on not the nerdy philosophy that I do, but based on the sort of reporting and covering current affairs that I do, a friend of mine in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation explained that they were going to have gaps in their coverage of the war over the summer of 2022, and they asked if I'd be interested in covering and reporting on it for them. And I kind of thought, well, I could spend the summer writing a nerdy academic article that maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 10, maybe 20, if I'm really lucky, people will read. And then I decided, what's a more valuable use of my time? Obviously, I'm going to go to Ukraine. I'm going to report on the war for the Canadians in the hopes of reaching millions of them, and in some ways in the hope of waking them up out of their dogmatic slumber, right? Their complacency. So I thought this was a more valuable use of my time than doing academic work. So I packed my bags, got on a plane, flew to Warsaw, and took this 20-hour overnight train to Kyiv, which I imagine some of these people here are familiar with doing. So I spent some time covering kind of civilian life in Kyiv. I spent some time on the front line in Kharkiv, Saltivka. I spent some time in Kramatorsk, Mykolaiv. I've seen some things that you don't want to see, and I hope people in this country don't have to see anytime soon. And then I was commissioned to do this story on the state of higher education in Ukraine. My editor thought, okay, this guy's a professional academic, maybe he should write something about the state of higher education in Ukraine. And as you might well imagine, things were in a bit of disarray. At the time, the Ukrainian Ministry of Education had estimated that something like 7,000 Ukrainian academics had fled the country. Something like 120 educational institutions had been bombed or damaged. This was in some ways kind of expected, but there was one thing that I didn't expect. So every time I was interviewing a Ukrainian rector or president of a university, they explained to me that we see all this Western support for Ukrainian academics who've left Ukraine, right? I was at the University of Toronto. They set aside $3 million to take all these Ukrainian academics and students in, but there was no money going into Ukraine. And this was sort of surprising to me. And this really stood out. And then another thing that really stood out to me was that Ukrainian sort of students and scholars were just doing incredible work in their community. So they're trying to keep their universities running, but they're also, for example, volunteering to visit elderly people in their homes who are alone because their family either fled or their children were fighting on the front line. The students were fundraising for veterans, they were supporting people, and it was really inspiring. So this was another moment where I kind of had to scratch my head and think. Just as I had thought going and reporting in Ukraine was more important and valuable than writing a nerdy academic essay over the summer, I then realized, well, I could report on Ukraine, or maybe I can do something to help my fellow academics who are doing really inspiring work in Kyiv. And by the way, they were doing it with absolutely no funding. There had been state budget cuts to higher education because we need to fund this war effort, right? So when I was done reporting in the summer of 2022, I went back to the University of Toronto and I organized this benefit conference to raise funds for sort of the civic engagement work that the Ukrainian academics were doing. So at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, I ran a benefit conference. We had a bunch of famous sort of public intellectuals. Margaret Atwood gave a talk, Timothy Snyder gave a talk. A couple of Ukraine's leading public intellectuals, including Vladimir Yermolenko, gave a talk. And also a bunch of famous philosophers, including our public lecturer today, Jeff McMahan, gave a talk. And we ended up raising about $50,000 for academics in Ukraine, which may not sound like a ton if you're in Canada, but $50,000 in Ukraine at this particular moment could go a long way. And so then it was immediately after this benefit conference that the editor-in-chief of Studia Philosophica Estonica wrote to me and asked if I'd be interested in transforming some of the talks in this benefit conference to a special issue of their journal. And I know that Estonia has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine, and I thought, absolutely, I'm very happy to do this. But instead of writing a typical academic article or collecting a series of typical academic articles, I thought we'd try to do something a bit different, which is take ideas that were developed in the academy, translate them into a language that is generally accessible so we can share academic knowledge in philosophy and what's going on in Ukraine with the broader community. And so I suggested we do an issue of public philosophy instead of a more academic theme. Now, I'm going to try and wrap this up quickly, but I do think I need to say something about the nature of public philosophy to explain what this journal is about, because I understand that there is no word in Estonian for public philosophy. And so, or at least it's not readily used, so I thought I should explain what public philosophy is. So at least on my understanding, public philosophy takes kind of three different forms: popular philosophy, applied philosophy, and what I call engaged philosophy. So popular philosophy is taking ideas that are developed in a technical language in the a technical academic language, the technical vocabulary of the academy, that academics use to make advancements in knowledge, right? They develop this very specialized language so they can discover new ideas and new things. But once we've used this academic technical language to unearth a new or novel idea, this idea needs to be translated from that technical vocabulary into a language the general public understands. And so this is what I call popular philosophy. Somebody reads Plato, then writes a popular article about it to distribute these ideas to the general audience. This is one kind of public philosophy. There's another kind of public philosophy which takes ideas that have been translated into a publicly accessible vocabulary and then applied to analyze current affairs. So if the first version of public philosophy, popular public philosophy, is designed to educate people about the history of philosophy, a general education, applied public philosophy takes ideas that are used in the academy to analyze current affairs so people can make informed decisions about culture, politics, and what's happening in their lives. It's kind of a form of public service, if you will. So this is largely what I've been doing in my public work before producing this special issue for the New Statesman and the New York Times and other publications. And then there's a third form of public philosophy, which I call civic engagement, which is showing that you're committed to your philosophical ideas by actually leaving the academy, going outside the world and doing things, right? Living up to the ideals that you produce. So, if you're committed to freedom and democracy, you might go out and protest against voter registration laws that are restricting the ability of your fellow citizens to vote. Or you might protest against government regulation on speech or whatever. There are all kinds of. Or you might, if you're committed to these ideals, like fight an invading army. Now I'm like an old man who's not in terribly great shape, so I'm not sure I could do much to fight the Russian army. So I'm trying to do what I can here with this. Now, I think this special issue does actually all three of these things. It does popular philosophy, it does civic engagement or civic philosophy, or what I called applied philosophy, and it does engaged public philosophy. So it does popular philosophy because the sort of renowned people who are contributing to this have taken their nerdy academic ideas and translated them into a language people understand. After doing that, they've taken their ideas and applied them to the Russia-Ukraine war to sort of elucidate particular things, particular issues around the conflict, so that people around the globe have a better understanding of what's going on in Ukraine. And then I see it as an exercise in civic engagement, or what I called engaged philosophy, because, well, we're here today doing an activity together, but all the articles in this special issue are open to syndication to the general public. So media all across the world, so places like the New York Times and the Times of London and the Financial Times, they're going to be republishing some of the articles in here as a way to spread academic knowledge well beyond the confines of the academy and hopefully keep the Russia-Ukraine war in the minds of people far away from the front line, because having spent a significant amount of time in Ukraine, support from their Western allies is absolutely key, and we need to keep the population informed and engaged. So that's basically the sort of aim, is to sort of share academic analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war with the broader community in order to enhance their sort of moral, cultural, and political understanding of the conflict. It's also meant to keep the war in the headlines. And I suppose there's kind of one thing I want to sort of conclude with, which is I began by saying in some kind of mocking way that I do academic work and it's not so important because people don't read very much of this academic stuff. I'm writing for an audience of 10 or 20 people. But one thing I really learned when I was in Ukraine is that ideas really, really matter. And they really, really matter because ideas are capable of killing people and they're capable of motivating people to fight against oppression, right? This war is in some level about ideas Putin has in his head, his misguided understanding of history, his misguided understanding of Ukraine, and the way he propagates these ideas. So apart from spreading information to the general public about what this war is, I also see it as my tiny way and my contributors' tiny way to engage in this ideological struggle. So I think there is, apart from the battle on the front lines, which is, admittedly, far more important. If Ukraine falls, all the civic engagement I was doing in Ukraine doesn't mean anything. So the army is the most, they need support. But we can still do something to engage in this ideological struggle, and this collection of essays is part of that. So I might have went on a little longer than I should, but hopefully you now have some understanding of public philosophy and what we're trying to do and how philosophers are trying to contribute their small little part to this broader global phenomenon. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to somebody I imagine people at the University of Tartu know very well. It is my honor to introduce Margit Sutrop. She is professor of practical philosophy and head of the Center for Ethics at the University of Tartu. She's also a member of the Estonian Parliament, where she sits on the where she submits on the Estonian-Ukrainian Friendship Committee. And she's going to talk a little bit about the relationship between philosophy and politics, since she's doing both. And she's going to talk a little bit about the role of the academy in a time of crisis. So please join me in welcoming Margit.
Dear Ambassador, distinguished guest, Professor McMahan, dear Aaron, Wendland, thank you very much for organizing this very special issue and also the event that has brought so many people here in this room. I am really delighted to see how many people are concerned about philosophical approach to war. What I would like to say from my perspective is not actually politics, and it's not actually also philosophy. I leave it to others, but I would like to bring my ethical perspective, but say two things: what we can learn from the war and what we should learn so that the future wars would not take place. I'm working on values and values conflicts and disagreements. And I have been always struggling with how actually people, also in education, should make values their own, should understand how important are some of such kind of things like independence, peace, human dignity, democracy, because very often they become just labels, words that do not mean anything. Because these values are like stars, they are always there, we do not hesitate, we follow them, but we do not think about them. But the problem is that these values, especially political, socio-political values, actually need care. They disappear when we are not taking care of them. We have to do something to make them really stay and show us the way how to live a good life. And being one who is involved in values education, I have found out that what is most important is to actually make people use their imagination, to think that the situation can be different from what it is today. You should also use your memory and collective memory to understand that these things actually are not staying with us and are not actually self-evident. Values are things or states of affairs that people long for and value, but many things are only appreciated, really appreciated, when we have lost them and tend to lose them. For example, people only value health when they become ill. They are going to think about how good it is to be healthy. And so it is with democracy, with freedom, unfortunately also with peace. So we can say that we Estonians appreciate peace at the moment because we see war in Ukraine. It is curious, but we should say that Estonians have begun to understand the importance of peace and value independence after seeing our friends, the Ukrainians, suffering from the Russian invasion and from all these violations of human dignity. Our independence now is much more precious to us. We have great sympathy for the Ukrainians and understand and appreciate that they are also fighting for us and for the free world. Thank you so much for that. But being clear about values is not always enough. This is where actually philosophy comes in. Values can come into conflict, and we have to also put them in some theoretical framework. We have to deal with the values conflicts and with the disagreements. Just remembering what happened in Tartu University, for example, I hope our rector allows me to remember this, was actually a big debate whether we should stop taking Russian students to study in Tartu University. This was a typical values conflict because on the one hand we wanted to actually keep the academic freedom and also bring democracy to Russia and help the Russian students to live in a peaceful world, do their academic studies, and hopefully return and bring more democracy to Russia. On the other hand, we showed solidarity to Ukraine, and we understood that our major aim is to help the Ukrainian students to study in Tartu University. And actually, we cannot control who is coming here, and we cannot offer at the moment the floor for their studies. And also, we would like them to return and stay in Russia to bring changes in the state. So it was a typical values conflict where people actually came in a real debate. And we solved in the Senate that for a certain while we cannot actually accept new Russian students, and we initiated programs for the Ukrainian students. Talking about war, especially for those of us who were unfortunate to experience it, is not easy. War brings always haunted narratives, and it is related to the collective memory. Let me say also something very personal. When the war started and they showed pictures of burning cities and people running for shelter from the bombs in Kiev, my 85-year-old mother said that she remembered the smell. She remembered not only this narrative of running as a 3-year-old child with her mother in Tallinn, with the sirens wailing and coming out smelling the desert. Half of Tallinn had burnt down. My mother was just one of those Estonians who remembered the wartime and interestingly enough, it's not only the generation who had been in war, it was also the children and the grandchildren. My mother went with my grandmother to Berlin to look for my father, who had been a ship's captain, and in 1939 she had been left at sea and did not dare to return. Otherwise, he would have been sent to Siberia. My mother and my grandmother and my grandfather never were reunited. Dad stayed in the second zone while Mom and Grandma were sent back. She was starving and suffering from tuberculosis. On the train back to Estonia, in one of the intermediate stations, grandmother sold her diamond ring for 2 raw chicken eggs, which she ate. She survived, and here I stand debating what war is and where ethics is coming in. This is the story of many Estonians, and people here are afraid that this time will come back, even if they did not see it themselves. It is a collective memory. When we hear about Russia deporting children from Ukraine, the stories of our people being sent to Siberia come to mind. Ethics of war comes in where we are now struggling to make sense of all this experience. I think ethics and philosophy, especially philosophical ethics, makes use of these personal stories, tries to order them, but tries to also put it in a framework, to develop the conceptual framework for understanding these painful memories. There is a big debate also going on whether there is, what is the role of ethics in just war theories, or can we speak at all, or use this oxymoron, ethics of war, ethics in war. However, the fashionable notion of ethics of war for many people is deeply problematic, because it is not war that defines the scope of the moral, but the relevant ethical concepts and doctrines about war that determine the specifics of the relationship between the war and the moral. We are going to learn more about these just war theories from our philosophical guest. But let me say also in the third part of my talk something about what I think we should learn from, or should do or avoid in order to not to make all these kind of wars in the future possible. In 2013, we published with our colleagues from Switzerland a book that was called Haunted Narratives, Life Writing in an Age of Trauma. And this was 1 year before actually Russia invaded Crimea. And we had a big discussion with my colleagues, and it reminded me when Aaron was telling about his experience in the colleagues in Canada, I think, or where you were saying that people did not really understand what the significance was. And the debate that we had there with our colleagues who were also the co-publishers of this volume, the Germans and the Swiss people, was whether we, speaking about haunted narratives for Estonians and for other people from the former Soviet Union, also the Ukrainians, can be actually described in terms of as collective trauma. Was this a trauma? Was this Holocaust? Or was this actually not describable like this for our countries, and it was only the Jews who were actually going through the Holocaust? In our first discussion, I did not understand how important it is what kind of words we are using, because they were stressing that actually Holocaust is a singular event. It was so horrible that this cannot be used as a general concept for explaining mass deportation and also killing so many people, that it was very, very specific, and we can only speak about this kind of memory in terms of just apologizing what happened from the Jews to the Jews, and making also the Germans themselves very much responsible for this. And very briefly, I would like to say, why is it important? And I think this is a lesson learned that we should also keep in mind when one day the war in Ukraine is over and we are going to actually hopefully have Nuremberg for Russia. What happens then? the really important thing is that the late president, for example, of Estonia, Lennart Meri, often expressed his sorrow that even with the availability of Stefan Courtaulds and colleagues' The Black Book of Communism, a long-awaited publication, the investigator of the communist crimes will be hopelessly at a disadvantage when compared to the investigator of the Nazi war crimes and crimes against humanity. The investigation of the crimes of communism has never been granted similar moral and financial support to the investigation of Nazi crimes after the destruction of the Third Reich. Even today, Lennart Meri says, the investigators of communist crimes only have a negligible part of the sources at their disposal. Two big steps forward have been taken. For example, he says in 2006, when the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly adopted resolution, need for international condemnation of crimes of totalitarian and communist regimes, and in March 2009, when the conclusions of the public hearing in the European Parliament, organized by the Czech presidency of the European Union, European Conscience and Crimes of Totalitarian Communism, 20 years after, were adopted. However, a lot more needs to be done and has not been done in the same way. So why is this all important, and why do I want to say it? Is that perhaps this kind of collective trauma that Ukraine and also the other post-communist states or former Soviet Union republics went through were never actually understood in the same way as we ourselves understand it by the Western European countries. And perhaps there is some kind of surprise for them, therefore, why the war actually broke out. And the difficulty to understand and the difficulty to decide to give the weapons that Ukraine is needed is related to this kind of conceptualization. I think, as Aaron said, ideas matter. I think also concepts matter. How we call these crimes, from what kind of legal perspective we evaluate it, how many resources we put in investigating these crimes actually influences how our future looks like. What will be our tomorrow? It is decided today. And we have to pay attention and be fair and be just in telling stories about our past without actually hiding it and without not actually using wrong concepts, without understanding that the evil has many faces, but it is still evil. So I think the philosophers of evil, the philosophers of just war and ethics of war have a lot to do, and I am very pleased to see that so many philosophers have followed the call, and I wish you all a fruitful work on working on this philosophical issues that actually matter and influence our future. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, speaking of Western support for Ukraine, it's my pleasure to introduce the extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador of Ukraine to the Republic of Estonia, Maksym Kononenko. He's going to say a few words about the values that Ukrainians are fighting for and why it's so important for particularly their Western allies to understand those values and to realize that when Ukraine is fighting, it's not just for Ukraine, but for values that we all hold dear. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador.
Dear Mr. Rector, dear professors, dear friends, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to this important event to discuss such an incredibly relevant and deeply painful topic as the philosophical rethinking of Russian-Ukrainian war. For every Ukrainian, discussing it feels like continuing operation on an open heart. However, I'm convinced that we must speak about it because only through discussion, analysis, comparison and contrast can we find the roots of this problem and, most importantly, propose ways to resolve it and offer a vision for the future. Once the famous French philosopher, member de l'Académie Française, Michel Serres, said in one of his interviews that the philosophy of 20th century was focused on forming ideologies, and all the problems and conflicts at the beginning of the 21st century are related to the fact that philosophers didn't do their job. They didn't shape a vision for the future in the new stage of world development. I don't know how fair his statement is, or whether the esteemed professors would agree with it. But from my diplomatic standpoint, it is increasingly seems that the world lacks meaning and concepts that could direct its development in a constructive way. Perhaps this special issue of Studia Philosophica Estonica may not offer a vision for the future of the next stage of the world development, but I'm convinced it will make a significant contribution to this long and difficult discussion. When I was invited to participate in the presentation of this edition, I was asked to spend 10 minutes talking about the power of ideas and values for which Ukrainians are fighting for and are dying today. This is both a simple and very complex task. Simple because I'm not a philosopher, and complex because I'm not a philosopher. So I do not have necessary knowledge or skills for a scientific analysis of the problem, but I'm representative of a people who have lived through 3 revolutions and 2 wars over the last 30 years. All these events occurred during my adult and conscious life, so I have the moral right to speak about them, at least from the perspective of my personal experience. And you know what? The wars and revolutions that Ukraine and Ukrainian society have endured were directly connected to values. Of course, they can be evaluated in geopolitical terms, in terms of realpolitik, interests, spheres of influence, but at the end of the days, we must admit that at the core of these processes, values have always been central. And the very first of these values is freedom, both individual freedom and collective freedom. The freedom of a free person to determine their own life, and the freedom of a society to determine its destiny, which transforms into the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state, its ability to be self-governing and independent on the international stage. The Russians took this freedom from us 300 years ago, both personal and collective. We were suffocated in a brotherly embrace, lulled into the cradle of 3 Slavic brotherly nations. Our language was banned and our culture was usurped. We were made to believe that we were stakeholders in the Russian and later Soviet empires, when in fact we were simply occupied and enslaved. But we were never agreed to voluntary servitude, about which Etienne de la Boétie wrote so brilliantly back in 16th century. That's why it never worked with Ukrainians. Interestingly, in the Ukrainian language, there is the word vola, which simultaneously means both freedom as the absence of oppression and enslavement, and will as the desire and ability of a person to act in pursuit of consciously set goal, overcoming internal and external obstacles. On August 24, 1991, we demonstrated our vola, will, and reclaimed our vola, freedom, something that was vitally necessary for Ukraine and every Ukrainian. We made a social contract to never, never, never lose them again. Today, in the face of Russian armed aggression, we are paying a terrible price for our freedom. We are paying with destroyed cities, with the lives and the health of our people, with the childhood of our children and the old age of our parents. Freedom comes at high cost, but 300 years of forced servitude have taught us that no matter the price, it must be paid because freedom is priceless. The second value, no less important, is democracy. As they say, democracy is the worst form of government except for all others that have been tried. Ukrainians quickly embraced its principles as democracy closely resembled the electoral traditions that existed in the Cossack state and were always inherent to Ukrainian society. In 2004, there was an attempt to take democracy away from us. Moscow decided to hack our electoral system and appoint a pro-Russian candidate, the Donetsk governor Viktor Yanukovych. The Ukrainian people, loyal to the social contract, said no and took to the streets. The Orange Revolution took place, and for the first time, the name Ukraine shone brightly on the world map. A democratically elected President Viktor Yushchenko came to power and changed the country's development paradigm. Instead of slogans, he began taking concrete actions, initiated Ukraine's real integration into the European Union and its rapprochement with NATO. The Orange Revolution was a fight for a key value, democracy. Since then, no one has been able to take democracy away from Ukrainians. Other important values include respect for human dignity and human rights, equality before the law, and the rule of law. The awareness of these values accumulated over the years like a snowball until it turned into an avalanche. On November 21, 2013, a few hundred people gathered on the Independence Square in Kiev to protest against the government's decision that threatened our independence and jeopardized our European future. At that moment, no one could have predicted that a new chapter was beginning not only in Ukraine's history, but in the history of the entire world. The events that would unfold 3 months would become the first step towards dramatic geopolitical changes. The trigger for these changes was once again the Ukrainian people's fight, not for material benefits, not for power, but for spiritual values, dignity, human rights, and the rule of law. These are values that in Europe they were rarely discussed because they were considered self-evident. In Russia, these values were silenced because they were seen as dangerous. 10 years ago, we demonstrated to the world that we see our future in the European Union and that we are ready to fight for this future. 10 years ago, we began a path of reforms that put an end to the Soviet legacy. 10 years ago, we won our first battle and stopped the Kremlin's hybrid aggression, which was aimed not only at our independence, but at destroying our values, rights, and freedoms. It's no coincidence that Ukrainian Revolution 2013-14 became known as a revolution of dignity. At that time, we formulated our national idea, dignity and freedom, which continues to unite the citizens of Ukraine to this day. There are the values that held our defense together during the hardest moments in February 2022. These values guiding us today, and these values will give us the strength to win tomorrow. Among those hungry for dignity and freedom who took the cold streets in November 2013 were many students. Alongside journalists, civil activists, and opposition politicians, they formed the core of resistance to the Yanukovych regime. It was the brutal beating of students by the Berkut special forces on November 30 that prompted millions of Ukrainians to take to the streets, publicly declaring that beating children doesn't align with values of the Ukrainian people. The realization of core values, what belongs and what doesn't belong to the fundamental values of Ukrainian society, has on one hand accelerated the formation of Ukrainian nation, of Ukrainians as a nation, and on the other hand, made war inevitable. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine not only because it needed our land or our resources. They have plenty of both. Not only because it needed our people. Russians place little value on human life and disregard losers, whether they are own or others. This war started because Ukraine and Ukrainians became bearers of values dangerous to Russia's autocratic society. We became a virus of freedom and dignity to them, a virus capable of infecting Russian society, eroding the centuries-old foundations of Russian prison, and liberating other enslaved nations, thereby putting an inglorious end to the project of the last empire, known as the Russian Federation. The Kremlin attacked Ukraine because it fears our values and yours. These values are not exclusively Ukrainian. They unite democratic societies across the globe. And if we share them, we must recognize that by attacking freedom, democracy, human dignity, and human rights in Ukraine, Russia automatically attacked all democracies around the world. The United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Estonia, many others. We cannot defend our shared values from this ruthless and powerful attack on our own. The only way to protect them is to form a democratic coalition and unite our efforts. The defeat of democratic values in Ukraine will have catastrophic consequences for democracies worldwide. It is not a secret that not only other totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, but also far-right and far-left radical forces within democracies are closely watching the course of Russian-Ukrainian war. A Ukrainian victory would serve as a red light for them. A defeat would inspire violent border changes and usurpation of governing institutions. From a value standpoint, Russian-Ukrainian war is existential not only for Ukraine, but also for the global community of democratic states. Helping and supporting Ukraine in this war is not an act of charity, but a crucial investment in the democratic future of every society. I would like to conclude my speech with personal story. I met the onset of the Great War while serving as Ukrainian ambassador to the Netherlands. In 2022, the Netherlands was celebrating a significant anniversary, 450 years since the Gozen uprising in the town of Brielle, which marked the beginning of the Dutch Revolution and their fight for independence. I learned more about this event and was so impressed by its significance that when the time came to prepare President Zelensky's speech to the lower house of the Dutch parliament, I suggested including a reference to this uprisal in his address. I would like to conclude in April 2022, there was a moment when Western governments were taking a very restrained position on helping Ukraine. And President Zelensky was addressing parliaments and societies to pressure politicians into action. On March 31st, he addressed the Dutch parliament with a speech and reminded the Dutch that alongside the King's birthday and the Tulip Festival, their country also has Independence Day, the day of the beginning of the armed uprising against tyranny, the day that began their journey to freedom. The speech had a huge resonance in Dutch society. The Netherlands had lived in freedom, democracy, and peace for so long that they had forgotten the true weight of these values. It seemed to them that these values had always been there. President Zelensky made them realize that freedom and independence are not given. They must be fought for every day. And it's true. No matter how old, stable, and successful a democracy may be, if it doesn't fight for its values, if it doesn't fight for its own and others' freedom, democracy, and human rights, it will slowly slip into the abyss of authoritarianism and the desert of tyranny. I hope that this issue of Studia Philosophica Estonica about Russian-Ukrainian war will serve as a similarly powerful reminder. Thank you so much for your attention. Slava Ukraini! Allah Questi!
So, of course, it is very hard to follow that, but I would just like to confirm the ambassador's remarks. I am Canadian. I don't have any particular personal connection to Ukraine, but the amount of time I've spent with Ukrainian people over the past 2 years and the time I spent in Ukraine has taught me that the things they are fighting for are values that maybe I had taken for granted 5-10 years ago, but they're values I studied in the academy, that I looked at analytically, but they are definitely values worth fighting for. They're definitely fragile, and it's very obvious, and I have great respect for all the Ukrainians who are standing up for values that I hold dear, and I take that most people, if not all people in this room, hold dear. So thank you. Okay, it is my honor and great pleasure to introduce a friend of mine, Jeff McMahan. Jeff is Sakura and White's professor in moral philosophy. He's been working with me in an academic way on the Russia-Ukraine war for a couple years now. And today he's going to talk to us a little bit about just war and the ethics of killing, an analysis of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Please join me in welcoming Jeff.
Thank you. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you here. As Aaron indicated, I'm one of the philosophers speaking here today. We actually got three. I'm going to be talking with you about the ethics of war. and in particular what's known as just war theory. This is a tradition of thought about the morality of war that goes back more than 2,000 years. In the early stages in the evolution of just war theory, the main contributors were philosophically oriented theologians in the Christian tradition. Just war theory is, by the way, a Western invention, a set of Western ideas. There are parallel views in China, Islam, and other traditions, but the just war tradition is the best known and best developed of these in the world. There is one point on which all just war theorists, that is, people who think and write about the ethics of war, agree, and that is that the aims that a war is intended to achieve must be just in order for the war itself to be permissible. That is to say, only certain morally important goals can justify the resort to war. Russia has, of course, made a pretense of having just goals in invading Ukraine. Initially, this was said to be a war of humanitarian intervention to protect Ukrainians, who are really Russians, after all, from a genocide conducted by a Nazi regime in Kyiv. This was just transparently a lie, and it should have been obvious to any Russian soldier who actually went into Ukraine. You could see that this was totally false. The second justification has been that this is a war to defend Russia from aggression, either by Ukraine or by NATO through Ukraine. And again, I just think it's totally preposterous to suppose that anyone in Russia ever feared military aggression by Ukraine. And I also really find it hard to believe that they even really fear an unprovoked attack by NATO. Just as really no one in the US government fears an unprovoked attack by Russia. Perhaps there really was a concern about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO and eventually allowing the deployment of short-range nuclear missiles right there on the Russian border. But there was no threat to Russia from anyone at the time of the Russian invasion. And all just war theorists throughout history have agreed that war must be necessary for the achievement of a just cause. And preventive war, which is war to prevent some future threat, was clearly not necessary to avert some unlikely threat to Russia in the future. Addressing distant threats of this sort is, after all, what diplomacy is for. So the real aims of the Russian invasion of Ukraine were really two, I think. One was first to expand Russian power and control by restoring the Russian Empire so that it would eventually become coextensive with its former borders under the Tsars and the Soviet dictators. And secondly, as the ambassador very eloquently pointed out, the real threat to Russia was the threat from a large, formerly colonized territory, the threat that this posed to Putin by being an example of an independent, economically flourishing democracy right there on the border of Russia. Ukraine has been highly visible to Russians as it has evolved into an appealing alternative to Putin's tyrannical kleptocracy in Russia. And this was the real threat, the threat of this example right there at the doorstep. And reestablishing the Russian Empire and eliminating the example of a flourishing democracy are clearly not just causes for war. They do not provide any justification for going to war against another people. By contrast, Ukraine's war against Russia is a paradigmatic case of a just war of defense against aggression. And the threat to Ukraine is very grave. Ukrainians have had ample experience of being under Russian domination in the past, particularly during the famines of 1933-34 and 1946-47. They're very familiar with Russian benevolence from those periods. So, while all just war theorists agree that the resort to war is impermissible in the absence of a just cause, and they even tend to agree to a very considerable extent about what aims or goals constitute just causes for war and could, in principle, justify the resort to war, there have developed in the just war tradition different schools of thought that are in deep disagreement about what it's morally permissible for soldiers to do in war. And that's really what I'm going to talk about mostly today. Because these disagreements emerge quite strikingly and vividly in the war in Ukraine now. What has come to be known as traditional just war theory, or the traditional theory of the just war, which until very recently has been dominant for several hundred years. This theory, traditional just war theory, is collectivist in character. So according to this view, the moral principles that govern the resort to war apply only to states, not to individuals. They tell states not to fight unjust wars, but they don't say to individuals, don't fight in a war that is unjust. I'm going to explain this a little bit more here. Let's refer to soldiers who fight in just wars as just combatants, and to soldiers who fight in unjust wars as unjust combatants. The traditional theory of the just war includes a doctrine that is called the moral equality of combatants, according to which just combatants and unjust combatants all have the same rights, the same duties, and the same moral status. Thus, unjust combatants, according to the traditional theory, do nothing morally wrong simply by fighting in an unjust war. They do wrong only if they violate the moral rules governing the conduct of war. In particular, the prohibition of attacking civilians intentionally. According to the traditional just war theory, therefore, Russian soldiers are acting permissibly when they drive their tanks or fly their planes into Russia, provided that they attack only Ukrainian soldiers and not civilians. Now, to me, this is really impossible to believe. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukrainian soldiers, members of the Ukrainian military, had done nothing to make themselves morally liable to be attacked by Russian soldiers. They were just there on their own soil, doing what they do. So what possible justification could there have been, morally, for Russian soldiers to go into Ukraine and kill Ukrainian soldiers? Of course, after the Russians invaded, Ukrainian soldiers did begin to threaten those Russian soldiers. But that doesn't entail that the Russian soldiers have a right of self-defense against Ukrainian soldiers. They forfeited that right when they unjustifiably invaded Ukraine and began to threaten innocent people. So they not only forfeited their right not to be attacked, but they forfeited their right of self-defense as well. Let me give you an analogy. Suppose a man with a loaded gun enters a house and has the intention of holding the members of the people members of the family, let's say, who live in this house captive, and perhaps killing some of them. And let's suppose further that there's one person in the house who actually has a weapon and attacks this intruder in defense of himself and the other people in the house. It would be absurd to suppose that the intruder who has come into this house with a gun to threaten these people has a right of self-defense against the person who has attacked him. That's just silly. He's forfeited that right. And according to what has come to be known as revisionist just war theory, which is an alternative to the traditional just war theory, war is really no different from this domestic situation in the house that I have just described. That is to say, Russian soldiers are relevantly like the intruder who comes into this other people's house and threatens them. And Ukrainian soldiers are like the person in the house who has a weapon, who tries to defend himself and the other innocent people in the house from the intruder. So, when Russian soldiers invaded Ukraine, they made themselves morally liable to defensive harm by Ukrainians. And they thus have no right of self-defense against Ukrainian soldiers. And in defending themselves and others from unjust aggression by Russian soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers do nothing to make themselves morally liable to attack by the Russian soldiers. Again, they're like the man in the house I just described. So, to put this in slightly more technical terms, Ukrainian soldiers are innocent people in the relevant sense. They are not morally legitimate targets of attack by Russian soldiers, as the traditional theory of the just war says they are. So I'm referring to just war theorists consistently for more than 300 years up to the beginning of this century, which is when revisionist just war theory, which actually has its roots in elements of just war theory that go much farther back in time than the traditional theory does. So, what I'm saying is that the traditional doctrine of the moral equality of combatants is simply false. It may be true, it is true as a matter of law, that soldiers who fight in an illegal war don't do anything illegal merely by fighting at that war. They do something illegal only if they violate the rules of war. But this is not true of the parallel morality of war. Morality of war and law of war diverge very sharply on this view, according to revisionist just war theory, not according to the traditional just war theory. Nevertheless, defensive action by just combatants against unjust combatants being Russian soldiers in Ukraine, is subject to moral restrictions. This is not to say that if you're an unjust combatant, if you're a just combatant, you're free to do just anything. The conduct of just combatants is governed by principles, both moral principles and legal principles, though these principles, as I said, I think are quite different. Moral principles do not run parallel to the legal principles. In particular, the constraints that govern Ukrainian combatants most particularly are the requirements called necessity and proportionality. Necessity requires that war, or the continuation of a war, be morally the best means of pursuing a just cause. So the requirement of necessity is essentially comparative. It compares going to war, or it compares an act of war with some alternative to this as a means of achieving a just aim. Proportionality, another important restriction, both in morality and in law, and quite different in those respects. I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. I think myself that the legal requirement of proportionality is completely incoherent. A sad fact about the Geneva Conventions, but we can talk about that later if you want to. But proportionality requires that the bad effects of war or of an act of war not be excessive in relation to the good effects. So unlike necessity, proportionality is not comparative. If a war would be disproportionate, it must not be fought. If an act of war would be disproportionate, it must not be done. Now, a number of prominent commentators have argued that Ukraine ought to end the war by offering to negotiate with Russia. And the arguments that they've given, the most prominent ones that I have seen, implicitly appeal to the requirements of necessity and proportionality. That's not explicit because many of these critics are not philosophers or legal theorists who understand these matters, but what they say makes this kind of appeal. And I'm going to give you an example. The example is from a man I greatly admire, Noam Chomsky, who's a philosopher and linguist and a very prominent left-wing political writer. I trust that many of you know of Chomsky. Chomsky has recently argued, and I'm quoting now, for a diplomatic settlement that would end the war without destroying Ukraine and going on to destroy the world. This settlement should, he says, and I'm quoting again, involve neutralization of Ukraine, some kind of accommodation for the Donbas region with a high level of autonomy, maybe within some federal structure in Ukraine, and recognizing that, like it or not, Crimea is not on the table. Now, I want to say this is tantamount to the claim that continuation of war by Ukraine violates the requirement of necessity, because it would be morally better overall for Ukraine to make concessions to Russia, thereby enabling Putin to save face and bring the war to an end. So he's saying there is a better way of trying to achieve the just cause of some kind of retention of sovereignty by Ukraine. And we can think it would be, what Chomsky is saying is it would be morally better because in this way Ukraine would achieve its most important just aim of avoiding domination by Russia while also avoiding more death and destruction not only in Ukraine but in Russia and elsewhere. That, I take it, is Chomsky's claim. I want to suggest that this reasoning fails for two important reasons. The first and most important reason is that the vast majority of Ukrainians seem to prefer the continued risks of war to themselves to even partial capitulation to Russia. What this means is that most Ukrainians consent to the risks of continued war. They consent to the risk to themselves of continuing the war rather than capitulating to Russia. But if the potential victims of these risks and any consequent harms consent to accept them rather than yield to the Russians, then these risks and harms cannot be invoked in support of the claim that it would be morally better for Ukraine to end the war in order to avoid them. They don't want to avoid them. So I think the consent of the Ukrainians just simply nullifies this claim of Chomsky's that it would be better to end the war because that would be better for Ukrainians. There would be no more Ukrainians dying. Second consideration is that because Russian soldiers threaten to kill innocent people, a category that I've said includes Ukrainian soldiers, they are morally liable to be defensively harmed or killed. And this means that harming or killing Russian combatants does not wrong them or violate their rights. They've forfeited their rights. It's therefore implausible to claim that it would be morally better for Ukrainians to submit to the unjust demands of the Russian aggressors rather than inflict harms on those aggressors that they have no right, that they should not be inflicted on them. That's not a morally better outcome when people who are morally liable to harm aren't harmed, but other innocent people suffer to enable them not to be harmed. Now, there's another interpretation of what Chomsky is claiming here, and that is that Chomsky's claim that Ukraine should accept a diplomatic settlement that would resolve the conflict, again, without destroying Ukraine and going on to destroy the world. One can understand him as saying that because continuing the war risks escalation to a nuclear war that would destroy not only Ukraine but also the rest of the world, continuation of the war is disproportionate. So we can understand Chomsky's claims here as claims about proportionality, in addition to being perhaps claims about necessity. But again, I think that this is not correct. The risk to Ukrainians can't make their war disproportionate if they consent to those risks. That is, the risk to the Ukrainians. On the other hand, the risk of nuclear war engulfing areas of the world beyond Ukraine certainly can, in principle, make the Ukrainian war of self-defense disproportionate. And it's precisely the point of the requirement of proportionality that if an innocent party's self-defense against wrongful harm would inflict even greater harm on other innocent people, then the party threatened with the wrongful harm must not engage in this self-defense that would be even more harmful to others, but must simply endure the wrongful harm. That is what proportionality requires. It is a very stern and unpleasant principle, but I think it is obviously right. Again, take a individual case. If I can defend myself against somebody who will otherwise kill me only by, for example, as in philosophy examples, I happen to have a hand grenade, but not even though I'm originally American, I don't actually have a gun, believe it or not. But I do happen to have a hand grenade with me. So there's somebody is going to kill me unless I throw my hand grenade. If throwing my hand grenade is going to kill 5 innocent people as well as my attacker, I can't throw the grenade. Morally, that's impermissible. I have to let the attacker kill me. Okay. So the important question here is really a factual one, namely, how serious is the risk of escalation to nuclear war? Of course, any risk of nuclear war is serious, but we want to know whether the risk is sufficiently serious in this case to make the continuation of war in Ukraine by the Ukrainians disproportionate. I actually worried initially about whether even supplying weapons to Ukraine might be disproportionate because of the risk of escalation to a nuclear war. But thankfully, I was wrong about that. It turned out not to be a concern. Western countries have been supplying weapons to Ukraine without any suggestion that that's going to lead to nuclear war. Indeed, the evidence now suggests that although Putin has sought to exploit the fear in the West of escalation, indeed by threatening to use nuclear weapons, which he's done repeatedly, we now see that he is in fact not as reckless and irrational as he would like us to believe that he is. He's aware, clearly, that it would not be in his interest to have Moscow reduced to a radioactive ruin. So, for example, Western countries have now supplied advanced weaponry to Ukraine. Ukraine has attacked military targets in Russia. And Ukrainian forces have recently entered Russian territory and now control a significant border region, all without provoking any significant escalation other than increased terrorist attacks by Russia on Ukrainian cities, which are not to be dismissed, obviously. But again, this is not escalation to nuclear war. So in my judgment, oh no, there it is, sorry. So in my judgment, the risk of escalation does not make the continuation of war by Ukraine disproportionate, at least at present. It does, however, continue to make it disproportionate for other countries, and particularly countries that are members of NATO, to engage in direct military intervention in Ukraine by committing forces, for example, to the war there. That does seem to me to be an option that would be not only morally permissible, but morally required were it not for the threat of escalation. So all countries would be required to intervene morally in defense of Ukraine, except for this threat of escalation to nuclear war. And one urgent question at present is whether the risk of escalation makes it disproportionate for Western countries to permit Ukraine to use weapons they have supplied for strikes against military targets deep inside Russia. This is a contentious question at present, as I'm sure you're aware. My view is that this should be permitted, though only for strikes on military facilities that have been used for strikes against Ukraine. Given that Ukraine has already been striking military targets in Russian territory, I think merely extending the range of those attacks is insufficient provocation to make giving them permission to do that disproportionate or impermissible. It is, however, in my view, essential for Ukraine to refrain from any such attacks that might cause significant casualties as a side effect. Although I believe that Russian civilians have a duty to oppose their country's aggression, their individual responsibility for the war is insufficient to make them morally liable to more than minor harms. The only justification for risking serious harm to Russian civilians is what's known in moral philosophy as a lesser evil justification, according to which it could be permissible to harm innocent people if, but only if, that is necessary to prevent very substantially greater harm to other innocent people. So this is what's known in moral philosophy as a lesser evil justification. It's permissible to harm innocent people when doing so is absolutely necessary to prevent much greater harm to other innocent people. And this could justify harming Russian civilians. Now, we're discussing harm to Russian civilians now. I want to conclude by pointing out that this is another matter on which traditional just war theory and revisionist just war theory are in profound disagreement. Traditional just war theory treats the distinction between civilians and soldiers as morally fundamental. That is the basis of what in just war theory is referred to as the principle of discrimination. You must discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate targets. Civilians are never legitimate targets. All soldiers are legitimate targets on both sides. So, according to the traditional just war theory, it's always impermissible intentionally to harm civilians, though it can be permissible to harm them as an unintended side effect, provided doing so is necessary and proportionate. Now, revisionist just war theory doesn't attribute any significance to any intrinsic significance to the distinction between civilians and soldiers. That's not important. According to revisionist just war theory, the fundamental distinction is between those who are morally liable to be harmed because of their moral responsibility for some unjust threat, and those who are not morally liable to be harmed. So this is in itself an evaluative notion, unlike the notion of a civilian or a soldier. It's a normative notion. Now, of course, normally, most civilians in a country that's fighting an unjust war bear little or no responsibility for their country's war, and thus are not liable to any significant harm by the other side. So there's substantive agreement there between traditional and revisionist just war theorists. But according to revisionist just war theory, sometimes civilians can make themselves morally liable to be killed. Let me give you the most obvious example. In World War II, there's a very famous and important physicist, Werner Heisenberg, who was working to provide Hitler with an atom bomb. He didn't succeed, but if he had been on the verge of succeeding in handing Hitler an atom bomb, I think it would have been not just permissible, but morally obligatory to kill him to prevent him from doing that. That was a very important goal, and he would have been guilty of posing an unbelievably serious, unjust threat to people everywhere by giving Hitler control over such a weapon. So he would have been liable to be killed even though he was a civilian. Now, I think that while most Russian civilians have a duty to oppose their country's war in Ukraine, that doesn't make them sufficiently responsible for what their country is doing to make them morally liable to anything more than comparatively minor harms. I think it does make Russian civilians morally liable to the minor harms that they suffer as a result of the imposition of economic sanctions. So I have always been in favor of economic sanctions against Russia. I'm not sure they've been terribly effective, but Russian civilians, it seemed to me, have no right to say it's wrong to harm us by denying us McDonald's hamburgers in Moscow. That's preposterous. But I want to make one more point, and that is that harming Russian civilians, even if only as a side effect, would, I think, be very counterproductive for Ukraine, in that it would make other Russian civilians less likely to oppose their government's continued war, and it could also jeopardize the moral support that Ukrainians enjoy throughout most of the world. If Ukrainians begin to harm large numbers of civilians, particularly intentionally, and there is some small evidence that when the Russians made strikes in, I don't know how to pronounce it, Belgorod, a number of civilians were killed. I don't know whether they were killed intentionally or not. If they were killed intentionally, that's terrorism, and it's totally wrong and counterproductive. So the point here is that even if harms to Russian civilians as a side effect, unintended side effect of military strikes, would be proportionate in themselves, that is, if achieving the military goal would be very important, so that it could be proportionate in relation to so that the harms to civilians that would be unintended but unavoidable would be proportionate in relation to the importance of the military objective. Nevertheless, such a strike or attack might be disproportionate because of the indirect effects on the probability of ending this dreadful war in a way that would constitute a victory for Ukraine. We want Ukraine to emerge victorious, and to do that, Ukraine has to maintain the moral high ground, which it has done wonderfully so far against a thoroughly evil adversary. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I would like to invite our speakers back up to the panel. I had intended to have a brief discussion, but we've organized an issue of public philosophy, and part of the idea here is to engage with members of the public. So after maybe Jeff grabs a quick glass of water, I'm going to give our other speakers, Ambassador and Margit, if you happen to have a question for Jeff, please feel free to ask it. After our speakers have had a chance to ask a couple questions, then I will open it up to the audience for public discussion. So, do you have some questions for Jeff by chance, or? Yeah, please.
I'm sorry, I think you don't see it.
Oh, there's some mics. Yeah.
Okay, this way? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I just stand up because I think there is such a big audience, you don't see us. But let me first say many, many thanks to our distinguished speaker. It was really great demonstration how philosophy could help to bring arguments and sort out arguments and find the define different positions and make it useful also for the decisions to be made by the politicians, I would say. So thank you so much for that. But starting from the very last point of your presentation, which has been also in your work important, but I would like just to perhaps also for the pedagogical purposes ask you actually whether it makes difference which kind of ethical theory you are actually representing. Because saying that, for example, somebody who is attacking Hitler to avoid actually huge evil and save many lives, the question may be also whether you think that your duty is to actually defend or to protect life or to promote life. So to be just to perhaps about dirty hands theory, that the consequence is actually is more important than just to follow the principle of not killing, for example. Do you think this is an important that actually you first in these kind of discussions also define what sort of ethical theory you are actually favoring? Thank you.
Well, even though I do admit to being what's called a revisionist just war theorist, I don't really have a developed general moral theory. I'm not what people call a utilitarian or consequentialist, because I think there are more things that matter morally than just what happens in the world. I think that for example, there is a moral difference between doing harm and allowing harm to occur. And I think that there is a moral difference between intending wrongful harm and causing such harm as an accidental or unintended side effect. But these are considerations that are independent of consequences. I do think that it is not only permissible, but in some cases morally required to kill people to prevent those people from wrongly causing even greater harm to other people. And I think there can be both a kind of justification that I described as a liability justification and a lesser evil justification for these acts. These acts are best avoided if at all possible. They are subject to the constraint of necessity. I think that whenever possible, nonviolent action is preferable to violent action. So, for example, I have thought for a very long time that it was both immoral and imprudent for Palestinians to engage in terrorist activity against Israelis. I think that the Palestinians ought to have engaged in Gandhian nonviolent resistance against the Israelis, and if they had done that, they would have had their own state 50 years ago. This is not to say that I think that anything that Israel is doing now is permissible. I think it's all an atrocity on the side of Israel. But I do think when nonviolent alternatives are possible, they are and promise to be effective, they are to be decisively preferred. But I can't imagine that having Zelensky instruct everybody in Ukraine just go have a big sit-in in the roads and block the Russian tanks from reaching Kyiv would have been very effective against the drive to capture Kyiv. So I don't blame the Ukrainians for not engaging in nonviolent resistance of a Gandhian sort.
Yeah. Ambassador, do you have something you would like to ask Jeff?
Sorry. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation, excellent lecture. It was really inspiring. because diplomats are looking for inspiration, and sometimes philosophy, it is a very good source of such inspiration. I'm really glad to hear that you are supporting the idea of deep strikes into the Russian territory and to lift up all restrictions. What I'm wondering, it is, or how to say, I was a little bit confused when you said that Ukrainians should target only military targets in the deep of Russian territory. And I'm not a philosopher, I'm a lawyer, so I understand what does it mean, legitimate target on the enemy's territory from legal point of view, but from philosophical point of view, for example, refineries, railways, I don't know, energy infrastructure, which is used by Russian army, but at the same time can be used by ordinary citizens, is from philosophical point of view, are all these legitimate targets for Ukrainian strikes, or you think that it is not so? So I would be really interested in your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's an important question. I should have been more careful in what I said during the lecture, because I do know, for example, that in the Second World War, attacks by Allied forces on petroleum supplies to the tanks at the front lines were highly effective in preventing those tanks from continuing to kill Allied combatants. I do think that when energy resources have what's called a dual use, that is, they both provide energy and power to civilian communities and provide the necessary energy supplies to military forces, there is a question of proportionality here. It's a simple, I mean, not simple, it's a very complicated question of proportionality. How important is it to block a certain supply of energy to military forces relative to not depriving ordinary civilians of water and the ability to cook the food and heat in the winter and that sort of thing. And one of the things I was urging here is just this, that those are not just the only considerations that are relevant to proportionality. It's also the effects on people's attitudes and beliefs that causing this harm as a side effect to civilians will have. So in a way, to put it in a sort of provocative way, there is also this question of public relations. You don't want the Ukrainians to look like the Russians in depriving people of heat and the ability to cook their food and water supplies and sanitation and so on by eliminating their energy supplies. Same as in Gaza as well, though there I think it's been intentional.
Okay, so Margit put her hand up quickly for a little follow-up, so we'll have the follow-up and then I'll open it up to the audience.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to continue to say also how I understood. Although you said you don't have a fully developed ethical theory, I still think that you argue very much like a consequentialist, actually. But I agree with you that that the way how you put it, saying that attacking the civilians, even by side effect in Russia, can have huge consequences for actually, because people will get the excuse as if they are attacked. And this was something that you said that till now there was no actually way of saying that there was a justified excuse for attacking Ukraine, and this may cause it. And we have to be aware that this kind of argumentation will then help actually Russia to mobilize the Russian citizens against Ukraine, and I think this is very legitimate. But If you allow me just to say just one question about the civilians that I have been very much thinking about, that that in the Russia's war, you very nicely in your paper distinguish between the war of between Russia and Ukraine and Russia's war against Ukraine, and I am speaking now about Russia's war against Ukraine. In all these wars, you actually what the civilization has helped us is to form some kind of rules of carrying out the war, that some things are not legitimate. This is more about these rules of law that you were speaking, that there are things, even if you have war, that you do not do, that everybody has accepted, like you are not actually attacking the emergency cars with Red Cross. And what has shocked me, and I think many people actually got more to the side of Ukraine, also from other countries that did not understand the law in the beginning, was that they saw that Russia intentionally is attacking Red Cross car and hospitals and birth clinics and so on. So something that when the Ukrainian delegation came to Estonian parliament and said that for the first time told us that they are now painting these cars to mask, not to show that they are having Red Cross, this was a shock. Because this shows how big the evil is. So I don't know if you want to comment, but this was my understanding where the real evil comes in. It's not a normal war. There is something that is done to humiliate people and to violate human dignity, and also even these rules that actually have been accepted for carrying out war.
Do you have something you want to say in response, or shall we? Okay. Okay, like I said, this is meant to be an issue of public philosophy. We would now like to open the floor to audience questions. So, Pavel. Yep.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor, for your discussion.
Keep this one.
Thank you very much for you. Thank you very much for. Speak loudly. Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor. It's been a very interesting discussion. I couldn't feel but intrigued by how apparently small responsibility you attribute to Russian citizens regarding, it's here, thanks, to Russian citizens, more responsibility of Russian citizens in the war. I cannot help but think, at what point are the citizens of a country that are, with their passivity, enabling and allowing a daily barrage of bombs on Ukrainian cities for 2 years already, somehow, it seems to me, the amount of responsibility grows every day. And would you think, it would reach eventually a point in which Russian citizens are seriously morally liable for what's going on?
No, I'm reluctant to concede that. And in part that's because there's nothing that any individual Russian citizen can do to stop Putin. And the costs to any individual of speaking out and defying Putin are high. There are, as I acknowledge in my text in the journal issue, many brave Russians who have defied Putin. They are either in exile now or in jail for the most part. I still think it's true, from what I gather from talking with Russians with whom I've spoken, that most Russian citizens still support this war, and that is wrong. And it does make those who support the war morally liable to some harms if inflicting those harms would be effective in some way in bringing the war to an end in a way that's favorable to Ukraine. But liability is a function of a number of variables. One of them is how responsible or culpable a person is for an unjust threat. But another one is how much harm would be averted by causing some fixed amount of harm to this person. And if the amount of harm, if the amount of harm is significant, but the amount of harm that would be prevented by harming this person would be negligible, then that person is not morally liable to that harm. May deserve some harm, though I myself am not a retributivist. I don't really believe in deserved harm. I mean, I feel I have retributive instincts. I want to get Putin in a closed room and go after him with a baseball bat, but so I have these retributive instincts and intuitions, but I don't want to claim that Russian civilians deserve to be harmed, and I don't think that they are liable to be harmed in any significant way, because in part because I don't think they bear a sufficiently high level of responsibility, and secondly because I don't see how harming them as individuals is going to do Ukrainians any good.
Okay, thank you. Another question in the back there by the, so if you can just say your question loudly and I'll repeat it through the mic.
I'm an associate professor of European and comparative law. And as a lawyer, of course, I'm very curious on how just war theory has influenced international law. It clearly had its influence for the United Nations Charter, where there is only the right to self-defense as means for use of force. It did not influence so much the Geneva Conventions or then this kind of the laws in war. At the same time, in this area of international criminal law, there is again this clear influence that we condemn aggression, we try to really put individual responsibility on the perpetrators. So I'm wondering whether just war theory is able to convince perhaps international community and the states to legislate more, and whether you see any moral obligations within the theory to actually legislate in a way that just war theory would actually be realized.
So maybe I'll just follow up here quickly so it's on the question is recorded. So to what extent can just war theory serve as a guide for existing international law? In particular, you have this revisionist theory of just war. Does that require revision of international law around that? I hope that's a fair summary.
In what I have written about these matters, I have stressed that, at least at present, the law of war cannot coincide with the morality of war. They have to be separate and distinct. I mean, I gave one example of a way in which revisionist just war theory diverges from the international law of armed conflict. It denies the moral equality of combatants. It says that what unjust combatants do is morally wrong. It would be a mistake, I think, to say that what they do is illegal and criminal. It would be a mistake to try to prosecute all the people who have fought in an unjust war after the war is over. It would be a mistake not only because most unjust combatants have excuses, epistemic excuses. They didn't understand the terms of the war. They were deceived by their government. Often unjust combatants, as in this case, fight under, in the case of some Russian combatants in any case, they fight under extreme duress. The government threatens them, threatens their families, and so on if they don't join and go out to fight. If we were going to say that what unjust combatants do is criminal and that they are criminally liable, given that most of them have some excuses, we'd have to have individual trials for every single one of them in order not to be unjust. And that would be a vast waste of time and resources and would seem unjust to everyone. So I do think that there's a kind of this necessary divergence between morality and law. I do think that one of the reasons that traditional just war theory was so influential is that the morality, the just war theory and the law of war developed in tandem. They developed together. And the legal theorists and the moral theorists wanted to see them coinciding. The legal theorist wanted to be able to say, our law is morally right. And so that, I think, prompted, and because the law of war it is reasonably effective in constraining the action of combatants who are pursuing unjust goals. It tells them, don't attack civilians, use force only when it's necessary and proportionate, and so on. It does work to restrict what soldiers who are fighting in an unjust war do, and that's just hugely morally important. And for that reason, I think just war theorists wanted to say, yes, what the law says is morally right, and in one way that's why just war theory developed the way it did. And what the revisionist theorists like me are saying is, no, the law of war is good, but its function is to sort of give people incentives or deter people from doing certain things. Morality is not like that. Morality is concerned with what's true and what's false about morality. And we ought not to make it illegal for somebody or punishable for somebody to fight in an unjust war, but we ought also to be able to acknowledge that what they do in fighting in an unjust war is morally wrong.
Okay, some more questions. Maybe, is there anybody on this side? So I don't, okay. Yep.
Thank you very much. And as a Ukrainian, I would like to thank all the people who put together this issue of global. This really will contribute, I guess, to intellectual ground to help all of us. And my question is about proportionality and the risk of escalation. I was a bit confused. Maybe I have misunderstood something, so clarify that, please.
You need the microphone because it's not otherwise live streamed.
Oh, I will just repeat the question for the live stream. Go ahead.
So from what you said, it appeared to me that the possible response, the moral response from Ukrainian side is to be limited not by the harm already inflicted by Russia, but by what Russia can do hypothetically in the world is done with nuclear war and harming third parties, third countries, in case this escalates. And it appears for me to contradict the very principle of proportionality, because the bar set by the hypothetical harm Russia can inflict is obviously lower than the bar set by the harm Russia has already inflicted. I have the bar in the proportional response Ukraine and which Ukraine can act. So could you please elaborate on that?
Okay, I'm just going to do this so it's recorded. My best understanding of the interpretation is he had questions about your notion of proportionality. So Ukraine can justly attack Russia on Russian territory. They're justified in defending against Russian aggression, but there are certain limits. They can't do things that might cause Putin to send nuclear weapons, launch them against London or New York or something like this, because that would not be proportional. You wouldn't want to permit, even though Ukrainians are fighting a just war, they're not permitted to do things that would result in global nuclear war. Is this?
No, that wasn't getting at the essence
Okay, sorry,
of the
yeah,
question.
go ahead, Jeff.
What I take it this gentleman was saying is this. One can assess the proportionality of present action in relation either to the harm that the present action might prevent in the future, or one can assess proportionality relative also to the amount of harm that has been inflicted already by the wrongdoer in the past. So you take the overall harm that Russia has caused already, and so on. That's the standard of comparison for proportionality. That, I think, is what you're saying. Is that right? Yeah, what I would say in response to that is that there are proportionality constraints on different forms of justification for inflicting harm. One justification for inflicting harm on somebody is that this person has done something wrong and deserves punishment. And so we say this would be a retributivist theory of punishment. It says somebody deserves to be harmed because of something they've done in the past. And there, of course, there is, as you point out, a proportionality restriction, and the amount of harm that one should inflict in punishment should be proportionate to the amount of harm that the person has caused in the past and the degree to which the person is culpable for having done that harm. There's also another proportionality restriction on what are called reprisals in war. A reprisal is a sort of tit for tat. Your enemy does something wrong, you do precisely the same thing in return. This is called a reprisal, and the point of reprisals is usually deterrence. You say to the adversary, you do this to me, I'm going to do the exact same thing to you. And if it's killing some of our civilians that they've done, we will then kill the same number of their civilians, something like that. And again, that's subject to a proportionality constraint. The proportionality constraint is don't inflict more harm in reprisal than that which has been done to you in the past. But I'm discussing here proportionality in defense. And proportionality in defensive harming is purely prospective. It's not retrospective. It doesn't take into account how much harm has been inflicted in the past. And this is true of proportionality in individual self-defense, in individual defense of others, and of proportionality in war, insofar as the justification for war is not punishment, but defense.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions since we started late. Okay, I haven't taken anybody from this side, so please. Thank you, Jeff. I'll just let you repeat the question when you respond to it if you show you. So
yeah, the question was this. I've said that Ukrainians consent to the risks of continuing the war, and I was challenged on that. There are different groups of people in Ukraine. They are at different degrees of risk. People in the eastern regions are more at risk of harm than people in the western regions. People in the cities are more at risk than people living on a farm somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. And so different people in different circumstances may have very different views about whether they would like the war to continue. And that's just obviously true. And the only thing I can say in response to this is that my claim was a quite general one about what seems to me to be true on average. That is, when I read the material about surveys of opinion in Ukraine, what I find is people resisting capitulation to Russia, wanting to continue, not to negotiate. Clearly, there are many people in Ukraine who would prefer the whole thing to end, even if it involves loss of territory or whatever. And again, in regions like Donbass, there are clearly some people who would like to be part of Russia, others who, if Donbass region is given to Russia in a settlement, would have to leave, abandon their homes and so on, because they do not want to be governed by Vladimir Putin. So I was making a generalization, and it, of course, does not hold as a universal proposition. And I concede that's problematic.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yeah, sorry, please.
Can I pick up
Yeah, of course.
this question and say several words, a few words also? Actually, there is a a national consensus about the fact that we resist, that we fight, that we do not trade with our territories and with our people. Of course, unfortunately now Ukraine cannot, for many reasons, legal, security, financial, cannot have elections. So Ukrainians cannot express their support, opinion to different political views and so on. But still, Ukraine remains a democracy. You can easily speak to journalists, you can easily give an interview. There are surveys, there are polls made by our journalists, which are public. They were published in many media, and we follow these surveys, and from 60 to 70% of Ukrainians which are still living in Ukraine, they support this resistance. That's why at this moment it is not a matter of discussion, question of discussion. So, and I would like to come back to the question of moral responsibility, because for me it's a little bit more complicated, more complex than that. Now we are talking about Putin's Russia. We are saying that Putin distorted Russia, created such a terrorist, such a violent state, and so on, so on. But I would like to talk about Russians Putin. Because Putin, he didn't appear from nowhere. He was formed by this Russian society, with these Russian values, or lack of values, absence of values. He is supported by Russian population. Like in Ukraine, there are surveys of Russian public opinion, up to 70%, even more, are supporting Putin in his aggression against Ukraine. Not Putin in every tank, in every aircraft fighting in Ukraine. So it is 600,000 soldiers who are fighting now against Ukraine on our territory. It means that there are millions and millions of members of their families who are supporting this aggression, sometimes supporting very actively this aggression. So I think that question of moral responsibility here is a little bit much more than just moral liability of these people towards harm which can be caused to them. Of course, and there is a question of indifference, because there are millions and millions who are supportive. They are doing it actively, but there are tens of millions who are just indifferent. They don't care what is happening and what harm is done in their name to Ukraine and to Ukrainians. I think that they have also this moral responsibility towards my country. And you mentioned the issue that, of course, they are oppressed because they cannot resist. And Professor mentioned that their moral obligation is to oppose themselves to Putin. But they cannot do it because they are oppressed actually in their own country. There are different instruments. Putin controls everything. But I'm wondering why thousands, 10,000s, millions of Russians who are abroad, why they do not protest? I saw tens, hundreds manifestations of Ukrainians in different capitals, but I didn't see just one big Russian manifestation against Putin and against this aggressive war to Ukraine. So I think that, in my understanding, maybe it's not philosophical category, but moral responsibility of Russia and Russians is much more higher than just their moral liability to the harm. I would be really glad if you can comment on it.
I will let both panelists respond because Margit also had her hand up. Go ahead,
Say
Margit.
first,
Yeah,
and then you
please.
can
Yeah.
end up.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I very much actually agree with the what Ambassador was saying, and I think it very well comes back to our opening speeches, because we spoke both about values, and I think the moral responsibility of the citizens, also of the citizens of the democratic and Western countries, actually, not only Russia, is actually to do something for these values. And if actually the whole society is not able, it's not only Putin, I very much agree, Putin is a criminal, but the question is how actually the society, like Russia, and also each citizen actually is not interested in getting more true information about what is going on in Ukraine, what their own soldiers are doing, the families whose kids are sent there. Not all are there because there is a gun there, just taken under the nose, but many take actually payment. There are prisoners who are actually getting the payment and go there and so on. But I think the most important question, since, as you say, it's a public philosophy and we are in the academy, we all have some responsibility, and I think it is worth asking actually what is our responsibility? What is it in responsibility in terms of which society it is, what we call good society, whether it is a state of law or is it something else? And I think there is also something that we very much actually hope that Russia itself or Russians actually do something about their state and about what is going on in Ukraine, but also what is threatening us all. And also to continue, I very much think that giving up now, my former colleague then, who is now going to Europe, our former Prime Minister, actually Kaja Kallas was always saying that when we give up a little piece of land, they will be so greedy that they will take the whole country, or the whole Europe, or the whole world. So we cannot give up, even if actually people in reality every day suffer. And this is why we are saying also, we are very, very grateful to every Ukrainian who is actually living under this threat and who is fighting, because you are not fighting only for your village, not only for your town, for your country, but you are fighting for the whole democratic world and our future. So I truly believe this is something where we have to think about ourselves as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Jeff is going to have the final word in response. I'm glad we got a panel discussion going anyway.
Yes, that's it's very good. I agree with what my panel members have said. I have been dismayed by what we might call Russian culture over the past few decades. I note that the Russian Orthodox Church has been an enthusiastic supporter of this war. I note that, I forget what the actual percentage is, but something like 74% of the Russian population now have a highly favorable view of Stalin. This is a culture that has been poisoned. I was in Moscow and Leningrad in 1989 as a very junior member of a delegation of philosophers, 5 of us from the American Philosophical Association, in exchange with the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And what I found in 1989, now this was under Gorbachev, was a profound interest among Russian philosophers, Soviet philosophers in Western philosophy, analytic philosophy. I sensed that there was going to be this convergence. I found the same thing in China in 2005, and it has actually continued in China despite the authoritarian nature of the communist regime there. But shortly after my delegation left Russia, We visited Tallinn, by the way. Didn't give lectures there, but we just came for a nice little holiday at the end of our time in Russia. Everything collapsed, and the cooperation between Western philosophers and Soviet philosophers completely disappeared, and Putin came to power, and that was the end of what looked to me like the beginning of a cultural shift in Russia. I agree. I think Putin is actually is more of a cause and less of a symptom of what's going on in Russia than Trump is a cause rather than a symptom of what's going on in the United States. I think he's really a symptom there. He's not the cause of it. He's too stupid to be the cause of anything. Putin is a bit more clever and can actually manipulate things effectively. Trump can't do that. What I want to say, though, in conclusion is this, and I think this is profoundly important. There are good people everywhere, and even people who are doing fairly awful things are usually capable of being better. And we have to try to find that good in people. So, for example, I know many Israelis, a lot of Israeli philosophers. I had an exchange on a Jerusalem Post podcast with some Israeli academics who said to me, I really doubt that there are any innocent people in Gaza. I was appalled by that remark. The Gazans have the same view, many of them anyway, have the same view of the Israelis. I've been appalled by the attitudes of Israelis during this dreadful war in Gaza that they are prosecuting there. A few months ago, I saw a poll that said that 68% of the citizens of Israel were opposed to allowing any food or medicine into Gaza. Now, food and medicine can get into Gaza only through Israel, and that's been true for ages. This is an appalling statistic. On the other hand, I do know many Israelis who have been heroic and courageous and decent and have opposed what their country is doing there. There are similarly Gazans who deeply disapprove of what Hamas did on October 7th. It's going to be true in any population. There are many good Russians. No doubt there are some bad Ukrainians, but we won't talk about them. Who knows? There certainly were in the past. In the Second World War, you had the extreme right-wing party that collaborated with. Anyway, what we have to try to do is to bring the good people together, and to do that, you have to do what I was suggesting at the end of my talk. Try to avoid harming Russian civilians. Try to be respectful of these people. Try to get them to understand the values and goals in Ukraine. That's the best way to change things in Russia. Make them, don't just be condemning them all the time, but try to reach out to these people. I don't know how in the midst of war, but somehow or other, the best way to change things in Russia is to appeal to whatever is decent in the people there, despite the long history of terrible culture in Russia. I'm thinking under the czars, under the Soviet dictators, it's just one long, endless nightmare there. But that can change, and we should do what we can to change it. And the best way to do that is by trying to reach these people and not just condemn them, and to try to not to harm them if possible.
Okay, we're a bit over time, but I would like to thank all my speakers. I would also like to thank the team who helped me organize this special issue. Without you guys, without my contributors, this wouldn't be possible. So please, a round of applause for our speakers. I would also like to say that there are refreshments on the side. Please have some coffee, some tea, and please carry on the conversation, because part of what we're doing here is to get people talking in an intellectual way about current affairs, in particular the Russia-Ukraine war. So,
Before you do anything, let's please have some applause for Aaron for all the work he has done in the journal and this.
thank you.